The Unbelievable Story of Plato, Part 1, Simplified Natural English. Welcome to one of the most powerful stories you'll ever hear, the story of Plato. This is not just a story about history, it's a journey into the mind of a man who helped shape the way we think today. And if you're learning English, this story is perfect for you. Because while you listen, you'll not only improve your English listening and understanding, you'll also train your mind to think clearly, question deeply, and grow wisely, just like Plato did. So sit back, relax, and listen carefully until the end. This is the story of a young man who began with questions and ended up changing the world. Before Plato became a philosopher, before he founded the world's first university, before he taught Aristotle, who later taught Alexander the Great, he was just a curious boy with a sharp mind and a big dream. The boy from Athens. Plato was born around 428 BCE in Athens, Greece, one of the most advanced cities of the ancient world. Athens was full of poets, warriors, artists, and politicians. It was a city of great beauty and intelligence, but also a place where truth was often sacrificed for power. Plato's family was among the most respected in Athens. His father, Ariston, claimed to be descended from the early kings of the city. His mother, Perictione, was related to Solon, the famous lawmaker of Athens. From the moment Plato was born, he was surrounded by politics, wealth, and expectation. He wasn't a poor child from the streets. He belonged to the upper class and had access to the best teachers and the best education. But even as a young boy, Plato felt that something was missing. He studied music, poetry, gymnastics, and mathematics. But unlike most students, Plato didn't just want to memorize answers. He wanted to understand why those answers were true. When his teachers said, "Justice means following the law," Plato would ask, "But what if the law is unfair? Is it still justice?" He was only a child, but he was already thinking like a philosopher. His teachers were amazed. He spoke beautifully, wrote poetry, and debated ideas far beyond his age. At first, Plato wanted to become a poet or a playwright. He wrote poems and plays, and even entered competitions. But one event would soon change the direction of his entire life. During Plato's youth, Athens was not at peace. It was trapped in a long and bloody war with Sparta, the Peloponnesian War. This terrible conflict lasted 27 years and destroyed much of what Athens was proud of. The democracy that once made Athens famous began to fall apart. Leaders became corrupt. People grew afraid. Truth was twisted by those in power. Plato saw all of this, and it broke something inside him. He began to lose faith in politics and in the people who ruled the city. He realized something powerful. Education is not enough. Power is not enough. We need something deeper. We need philosophy. And that thought would shape the rest of his life. The meeting that changed everything. Around the age of 20, Plato met the man who would completely change his life. Socrates. Socrates was unlike anyone else in Athens. He walked barefoot. He didn't care about money, clothes, or fame. He never wrote anything down. But his mind was sharper than anyone's. He stopped people in the street and asked them questions like, what is justice? What is courage? What is truth? When people tried to answer, he asked more questions until they realized they didn't really know. Socrates wasn't trying to insult them. He was trying to help them see that real wisdom begins when you admit how little you know. Plato was fascinated. He followed Socrates everywhere, listening, questioning, learning. He saw Socrates not as just a man, but as a mission to wake people up, to make them think for themselves. After meeting Socrates, Plato gave up poetry. He burned his early writings, saying, "Socrates is the only man who ever made me feel ashamed of my ignorance." He stopped chasing fame and power and started chasing truth. And from that moment, the world began to change. the death that sparked a revolution. Plato became one of Socrates' closest students. He followed him every day, watching how Socrates challenged the minds of others. But then tragedy struck. In 399 BCE, when Plato was around 29, Athens accused Socrates of two crimes: corrupting the youth because young people were following him and questioning authority, and not believing in the gods of the city because he talked about deeper, unseen truths. The real reason, though, was simple. Socrates was too dangerous. He was exposing the weakness of those in power, and powerful people hate being questioned. Socrates was put on trial. Plato watched as his teacher stood calmly before the judges. Socrates refused to apologize. He said, "I would rather die than stop asking questions." He was sentenced to death, to drink poison hemlock. Plato was there when it happened. He watched as Socrates drank the cup, lay down, and slowly lost feeling in his body. First his legs, then his arms, then his chest, until the poison reached his heart. But Socrates didn't cry. He didn't scream. He smiled and said, "The soul is eternal. Death is not the end." That moment changed Plato forever. It didn't just break him, it rebuilt him. He made a silent promise that day: "The world may kill Socrates, but I will never let his voice die." That vow became the fire that would drive him for the rest of his life. The academy became a place where great minds were shaped, and among its brightest students was Aristotle. Later, Aristotle would go on to teach a young man named Alexander, the one who would become Alexander the Great and conquer half the known world. In this way, Plato's academy didn't just shape students, it shaped empires. While teaching, Plato kept writing. Each of his books opened a new doorway into the human mind. He loved to write in dialogue form, turning ideas into conversations that felt alive. Some of his most famous works came during and after he founded the academy. The Republic described his vision of a perfect state, a society ruled by philosopher kings, people who loved wisdom more than power. In it, he shared the famous allegory of the cave, a story about prisoners who only see shadows on a wall until one escapes and finally sees the truth. Then there was the symposium, a lively dinner discussion about love and what it truly means. Phaedrus explored the soul, beauty, and inspiration. Gorgias warned about the power and danger of persuasion. And Laws, his last and longest work, laid out rules for a real city, practical laws for real people. These weren't dry writings, they were like plays, full of characters, stories, and emotion. Even today, people quote Plato without realizing it. Through every dialogue, he made sure that the voice of Socrates would live on. In most of his works, Socrates appeared again, still asking questions, still challenging the reader. But Plato wasn't only a writer or teacher. He wanted to bring philosophy into the real world, into politics. He believed that philosophers could help rulers become wiser and more just. So he traveled to the city of Syracuse in Sicily, where a young ruler, Dionysius the Sixth, had just taken power. Plato's friend Dion believed they could teach this young man to become a philosopher king. But reality was harsh. The court was filled with jealousy, power struggles, and whispers. Dion was exiled, and Plato was accused of plotting against the ruler. For a time, he was even held as a kind of prisoner. Eventually, he was allowed to return to Athens. The experience changed him deeply. He saw how hard it was to mix philosophy with politics, but he never gave up on the dream of a just society. Back in Athens, Plato threw himself into teaching and writing once more. It was during these years that he developed his most famous idea, the theory of forms. He believed that everything we see, trees, tables, people, are only imperfect copies of perfect forms that exist beyond our senses. Just like in the cave story, most people see only shadows. The philosopher turns around and sees the light, the real truth. This idea shaped philosophy, religion, art, and science for centuries. It taught people to look deeper, to search for what lies beyond appearances. By this time, Plato's Academy had become famous. Students came from all over Greece and beyond. Many of them grew to become teachers, lawmakers, and advisors, spreading Plato's ideas across nations and generations. Even though he never succeeded in turning a king into a philosopher, he created something even greater: generations of thinking citizens. His academy lasted for centuries, surviving wars and changes in power. It became the model for later schools, including the great universities of Europe. As Plato grew older, he became more than just a teacher. People respected him not for his wealth or position, but for his mind. His beard turned white, his steps slower, and his voice softer. But when he spoke, the whole academy listened. He was no longer only speaking for Socrates, he was now speaking as himself. Age didn't slow him down. It made him bolder and wiser. He knew his time was running short, but he had one final mission: to write a book that could guide a real society. Many believe his most important work was the Republic, but Plato thought even bigger. He began writing the Laws, a book filled with practical ideas: how children should be educated, how families should live, how to prevent corruption, how art and music could build good character. It was no longer a dream. It was a plan for a real city, a real civilization. Plato was no longer running away from politics. He was facing it, armed only with his mind. He worked on the Laws until his final days. During this time, his best student, Aristotle, began to question his master's ideas. Aristotle thought Plato's forms were too abstract, too mystical. He preferred studying the real world, things we can see, measure, and observe. Plato believed philosophers should stay apart from power, while Aristotle thought philosophy should guide rulers directly. Their disagreement became one of the great divides in Western thought: Plato the dreamer, Aristotle the realist. Both were brilliant, and both came from the same garden of wisdom, the Academy. Years later, Aristotle would be chosen to teach a boy named Alexander, the future Alexander the Great. Through Aristotle, Plato's ideas reached the mind of a conqueror and spread across 3 continents. Plato never ruled a city, never commanded an army, but his thoughts traveled further than any soldier ever could. In his later years, Plato spent more time in quiet reflection, sitting beneath the olive trees of the Academy. He listened to his young students debate ideas, smiling when they asked the same questions he once asked Socrates. He no longer tried to prove anything. He simply guided them, like a lighthouse, showing the way. Visitors from distant lands came just to hear his voice or touch his hand. To them, Plato wasn't just a man. He was a mind made human. He kept writing the Laws until his final moments. Some say he was still holding a pen when he passed away, surrounded by candlelight and scrolls. Plato died peacefully in Athens, the city of his birth, at about 80 years old. But in truth, Plato never really died, because Plato was not just a man. He was an idea that truth matters, that education is the highest form of justice, and that a mind trained to think is more powerful than any army.